Welcome to a new episode of The Law Beneath the Waves. In this episode, we turn to the Pacific Island region, a global leader in innovative and forward-looking seabed governance. Long before deep-sea mining entered mainstream international debates, the Pacific Island states were already developing regional principles and frameworks to regulate these activities. Their early action reflects a strong sense of shared ocean identity, one that places economic, environmental, social, and cultural stewardship at the center of seabed management. Joined by my guest and dear colleague Cameron Diver, we're going to explore today together how and why the region asserted this leadership so early, how its regional deep-sea mining framework has evolved through time, and how the Pacific Island states continue to shape global discussion on seabed governance. From pioneering regional frameworks to navigating today's divided position on deep-sea mining, this episode highlights how the Pacific is asserting its voice, values, and vision for the future of the seabed, both within and beyond national jurisdiction. Cameron, I'm very happy to have you today actually in a new episode of The Law Beneath the Waves. And I'm especially thrilled because we're going to discuss a topic actually dear to your heart and your practice for many years, the Pacific Islands region and the specific topic of deep sea mining. So the contribution you made to the book is very important because for Pacific Islands and the region have been known more recently for the sad challenges linked to climate change. But a lot of people actually don't really know the concerns and the work that have been doing the region with regards to seabed management and deep sea mining. I think it's very important to highlight the pioneering behavior actually of the region and how much actually they've been contributing to the development of the law of the sea. So the Pacific Island region is composed of only coastal states, more island developing states of Oceania, referred to as the large ocean states, which is a term that I love very much because I think it's more accurate of the reality. And the region gathers 23 Pacific Island countries and territories. So to name them, we have American Samoa, the Cook Islands, Micronesia, Fiji, French Polynesia, Guam, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, Nauru, New Caledonia, New Zealand, Niue, Tokelau, Tonga, Vanuatu, and Wallis and Futuna. This is correct?
I think that's probably right, yes.
And what characterizes actually Oceania is, of course, its exceptional oceanscape, as well as exceptional resources, biological, but also mineral. And as you mentioned in your chapter, in the aftermath of the Second World War, there's been external powers that have been actually playing an important role in the regional governance. So you have Australia, France, the Netherlands, UK, and the US, and they played mostly a role through the South Pacific Commission. But since decolonization, the regional governance has evolved, and personally, I will say the identity and specificity of the region has been very well asserted, marking their leadership and innovative spirit in terms of ocean management and shared ocean identity, which is something that you have mentioned actually in the chapter that I like very much, and I'm sure you're going to develop a bit more this concept. So as I mentioned before, they are more famous now for the sad challenges caused by climate change, but Pacific Island countries have been also very early on reflecting and working on issues of seabed mining and deep sea mining. And I will say actually even before most states, practitioners and academics actually pay attention to this topic. So that's why I call them pioneers in terms of development, in Law of the Sea. And as you mentioned, also they produced a world-leading regional framework. I will say frameworks with an S because it's a package. So there's many different types of instruments. So this episode is going to be dedicated to explaining actually not only the significance of the marine space and the resources, why Pacific Island countries have been concerned with deep sea mining very early on, and what have been their actually reply and action taken at the regional level to actually plan and de-risk as much as possible these activities. So Cameron, it's a pleasure to have you today in this episode. Maybe what we can start with is something quite broad. It's basically how vast is the marine ocean space of Oceania?
That's a really great question, and thank you very much for inviting me to chat with you today, Virginie. It's lovely to see you again to talk about this extremely interesting issue. The Pacific is, I think, the only region in the world that expresses its strategy and its development aspirations today through a link to the natural world, which is the blue Pacific continent. And so the Pacific Islands region can be very legitimately described as the blue continent. We have around about 800,000 square kilometers of landmass with all of the 23 islands that you mentioned, and around 30 million, close to 30,600,000 square kilometers of exclusive economic zone. We have countries like Kiribati, whose EEZs are, or, well, I say EEZs plural, are separated by areas of high sea. And so it's a region that you can probably fit, I think I've used this in other conferences, sort of all of the world's continental land masses can fit in the Pacific, and you have some space left over to fit one or two continents in there again. So it is a vast oceanscape. Yeah.
And since we're talking mainly about seabeds, and of course, the seabed management influence the management of the water column, we've seen that there's been a lot of overlapping maritime claims actually in the region. How do these overlaps affect the seabed management, and where are the negotiations currently going at the moment?
I think there are around about 48 overlapping or maritime boundaries that could be considered competing between Pacific Island nations. And there has been a huge amount of work gone into negotiating those boundaries because the overlaps lead to a lack of clarity around governance, a lack of clarity around who manages what and how which national framework applies, and even under regional frameworks or international frameworks, who's accountable for doing what in terms of implementation. So over the past decades, Pacific Island countries, assisted by intergovernmental organizations in the region and elsewhere, have made huge strides in working through negotiations to provide clarity at national, at regional, and at international level around the maritime boundaries that exist and the rights and obligations that flow from those, both in international law and then in domestic law.
Have ocean space actually in the Pacific region.
That's absolutely true. And I think that in parallel to the negotiations that I just spoke about, it didn't mean that there was a vacuum of ocean governance. There were principles that were agreed to, there were regional frameworks that were adopted. There is a common shared identity with the ocean that leads Pacific Islanders and Pacific Island governments to pay particular attention to sustainable management of the oceanscape in general, and to try and work through areas that aren't clear. Nothing's ever perfect, but I think that there have been, again, really strong instances of regional cooperation that have enabled the Pacific to have a common viewpoint around sustainable management of the ocean and of the seabed, to understand and accept sometimes differing viewpoints, but with the overarching objective of ensuring the sustainability of the blue Pacific continent for future generations, and ensuring that that benefits at national level and regional level the people of the region.
So it's very interesting, because if you don't have actually this knowledge of the state of the limits of the outer limits of national jurisdiction, and you just have a look, for example, at the different frameworks, you will actually not understand the context in which the frameworks have been developed, how they can be implemented. So I think these information are really precious for people actually who don't really know the region. And to come back with the importance of, I would say, certainty in a certain way about the limits of national jurisdiction, we've seen that many countries have actually filed submissions for the extension of the continental shelf. If I'm correct, 10 states actually have filed a submission, and so far only the Cook Islands have received a recommendation. So nothing alarming, because everyone knows that recommendations take a lot of time. And there's a very important queue to actually receive a recommendation from the CLCS. But the question that I had was, how significant actually are the areas of continental shelf, extended continental shelf? And a question that I ask everyone actually on these episodes is, why are states pursuing this extension? Because a lot of people associate the extension of the continental shelf to pure interest of exploration and exploitation of minerals, which could have been the case potentially at the beginning. But in the practice, when you look actually the position of states worldwide, it's not that clear, and a lot of states are actually pursuing this extension just to secure basically vast areas where they can actually enact their own environmental policy without actually having any interest of exploiting, because they don't have financial capacity, or because it's not actually their priority. So how is it actually translating in the Pacific region?
That's an excellent question. Just to give you and our listeners or viewers an idea of the scale of some of the extended continental shelf submissions. The Ontong Java Plateau submission, which was put forward by the Federated States of Micronesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, is over 600,000 square kilometers of additional seabed. So it's a significant area. More recently, Fiji, the Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu looked to put together a combined submission for around about 453,000 square kilometers of seabed, and that just happens to be the size of the world's largest island. If you put, for example, Australia as the island continent to one side, which is Papua New Guinea, which is another island in the Pacific. And again, that's to show the scale. These are huge areas of seabed that are being claimed, often again through international cooperation, through joint submissions. And this is being done, I think, for a number of reasons. There might be interest in the potential of deep sea mineral exploitation. We're talking about countries whose economies are developing. We are talking about nations and peoples who have a right to develop, and therefore are looking legitimately for ways in which they can respond to that right, based often on their natural resources, which are sometimes, next to the peoples and the cultures, the greatest wealth that many of these countries have. But there are also, as you linked to, ensuring that these areas beyond national jurisdiction are claimed by countries that have a like way of looking at the ocean and its resources, and the seabed and its resources, a like way, how should I put, a form of kinship that is shared with the natural world, and therefore that these claims could also be not simply to exploit, but to explore and understand and protect and sustainably manage these areas in the future. Because as you know, there is still a huge amount to learn in terms of scientific discovery about the deep sea. And if we do not explore it before we think about exploiting it, we could be passing, next to huge opportunities for science, for health, for other applications that have nothing to do with exploitation and its minerals. And I think the islands are cognizant of that, and again, looking to secure these extended continental shelves as part of a more holistic way of looking at what the deep sea can bring, rather than just thinking about it from the pure potential of exploiting deep sea minerals.
Yeah, I think it's a nice way to describe it. And I'm very happy you actually bring that into your clarity. To come back to the question of climate change that has been at the heart of the news actually recently, also linked to the advisory opinion on climate change that has had quite an impact. We've seen, and you actually explain it in your chapter, that in 2021, the Pacific Islands Forum has adopted a declaration on the preservation of maritime zones, highlighting the impact of climate change. How does climate change affect the management of the seabeds and national maritime zones, especially for the audience who actually are not really aware of, how the seabeds is actually, the management of the seabed is really interconnected with the management of the water column as well?
Absolutely. Okay, that's a multifaceted question. First of all, if you look at it at a very basic level, and in the most extreme of cases, if an island disappears, then one could consider that the maritime boundaries that are generated from the landmass may disappear with it. And therefore, the question arises as to who manages both the water column and its resources and the seabed that falls under that. That was previously within a national jurisdiction, but the question arises as to whether that national jurisdiction subsists or not if the landmass no longer does. The same argument could be run for coastlines that erode significantly over time. Do maritime boundaries move back? And if they do, then the area of the seabed under national jurisdiction could be considered as shifting back alongside that. And so Pacific Island nations, again, looking at it from the perspective of both vulnerability but also anticipating future changes, were pioneers in adopting this normative declaration that really seeks to preserve their maritime boundaries in the state at which they are submitted to the United Nations, with no change intervening, should climate change reduce the size of a coastline or ultimately lead to certain islands being uninhabitable or disappearing. And that is to preserve rights for future generations. That is to ensure that these nations who contribute less than 0.001% to global warming are not, again, disproportionately affected by a phenomenon to which they have contributed very little in their sovereignty, in the rights that they derive from that as regards the ocean and the seabed. And the question then comes to be, if one considers in the Pacific that this is a broadly accepted principle by all Pacific Island nations that is respected, will over time this crystallize into a norm of customary international law? Will other regions in the world where there are vulnerable coastlines or vulnerable islands decide that they too will adopt something that is very similar in nature? And so you have a form of almost interregional or transnational law that emerges around this to preserve maritime boundaries, and therefore the national jurisdiction and the limits, the outer limits of national jurisdiction and the start of the limits of areas beyond national jurisdiction. And I think from my perspective that it's also incredibly important, not only for those aspects, but because the ocean is an aspect of cultural heritage for the Pacific Islands as well. And that preserving those maritime boundaries is also an effort to preserve the cultural heritage of the Pacific Island nations linked to the ocean and their relationship with it. So it's a really pragmatic way of looking at what the probable effects of climate change will be in the region, and how to deal with those using the law as a tool to ensure that there's a form of climate justice and ocean justice that flows to the Pacific, the peoples of the Pacific.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think there's also a dimension of continuity of knowledge, in the management. So through the culture, but also, pure knowledge of management, how you actually inform decision making to utilize, access the resources, explore, exploit, manage fisheries. So you have, millenniums of knowledge that actually is there. And I think this type of legal solution that has been actually developed by the Pacific Islands promotes this sort of continuity of knowledge, and I find it very beautiful. Now that we've been discussing a bit the main issue related to the richness of the diversity of the oceanscape, I'm wondering actually also for the audience if you could explain, since the Pacific Islands have shown very early on interest in deep sea mining, I think it's worthwhile discussing also the presence of the three main deep sea mineral resources in the Pacific. And to clarify, I'm really mentioning in the EEZ mainly, explaining actually why the Pacific region has been working on this issue, because most people actually get focused only on what's happening in the Clarion-Clipperton zone in the area, but here it's really about the mineral resources in Oceania. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Certainly. Well, we have the three main seabed mineral types, if you like, that are referenced in and present in the Pacific. So you've got polymetallic nodules, you have seafloor massive sulfides, and you have cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts, which is a bit of a mouthful, but there you go. And what you have in the Pacific is quite a high concentration of these minerals in various parts of the national jurisdictions of Pacific Island countries. This is why, for example, as early as around about 1999, Pacific Island countries started looking at and developed a series of principles to guide the development of national offshore mineral management policies. Because the science had shown that these minerals were there. When minerals are there, there's economic interest, both at national level and at international level, including governments and private sector. And there is a need to put in place governance frameworks to ensure appropriate management of those particular resources.
To protect yourself, from the appetite of others, to the private sector is coming.
Certainly. But also because, for example, I can recall very early in my career where we were thinking about, there were requests, for example, for exploration of certain parts of the EEZ in New Caledonia to look for gas and hydrates and things like that. And the mining code, which was entirely terrestrial, was the only legal instrument that could be used to provide a permit to look at that. But we were talking also to have a properly adapted instrument so that the country itself is not working on the basis of legal instruments that might be completely terrestrial mining, but that are adapted to the context, the circumstances, the risks, etc., of mining the seafloor, wherever it may be, whether it's the deep seafloor or closer to shore. And so, as you say, it's protecting themselves from external interests, but it's also providing themselves with a domestic risk management mechanism that is adapted to the type of natural resource exploration and potential exploitation that could be taking place.
It's interesting what you mentioned, but because it's something that we realize throughout the book, and especially the domestic chapters, where actually these chapters reveal activities, because the mining codes are actually more terrestrial, and when they're not terrestrial, they're more, I will say, mainly focused on oil and gas, and have absolutely not the level of adaptation mining activities. And it's the case also, for the mining code in France. You were talking about New Caledonia, the overseas territories, the Polynesia, and for example, Wallis and Futuna. It's even more complicated, but there's a lot of issues linked to the lack of planning and adaptiveness of the legislation frameworks actually in most countries. So it's really interesting what you mentioned. So maybe before diving a bit more into the frameworks that have been developed actually at the regional level, I think it will be good for the audience to understand how the regional the cooperation, consultation, and how actually this cooperation is supporting, in that case of the Pacific, extremely well supporting the development of regional frameworks. But I think it's essential knowledge to actually understand this will be and the specific contribution to the region.
Certainly. The Pacific has, I would say, a really solid track record of regional cooperation, generally speaking. It has a number of regional intergovernmental organizations that were created. For example, the Pacific Community just post the Second World War, others that evolved in the 70s and the 80s and later on, to come in and provide forms for discussion and decision-making regional issues. And so today, for example, if we want to talk about the ocean and deep sea mining, for example, you have the Pacific Islands Forum, which is the premier political regional organization. You have the Pacific Regional Environment Program based in Samoa, which is a separate organization entirely focused on environmental issues. You have the Pacific Community, so the Pacific's oldest intergovernmental organization, which is across all 17 SDGs, but has a really specific focus on issues like ocean science, fisheries, sustainable management of marine resources, and things like that. You have the Forum Fisheries Agency, which looks after fisheries and quotas and IUU fishing aspects and things like that. There are a number of entities, all of which are an ecosystem of states that are from the Pacific and partners that are around the Pacific and worldwide that come in and support the goals and the aspirations that are adopted at regional level. And through these regional mechanisms, the Pacific, at the end of the sort of first decade of the 2000s, said to itself, we need to move on from the 1999 principles and start to develop some solid guidelines and frameworks that will help to really guide how the region and how countries approach the governance and the regulation of seabed mining activities. And so with the support of external partners, in particular under the European Union EDF, the European Development Fund, SPC and other partners, the Pacific Community, SPC is the acronym, worked to really bring together international and regional experts to develop a series of frameworks that would help to assist Pacific Island governments in developing effective national policy and legislation to anticipate the challenges of deep sea mineral exploitation and exploration, and appropriately manage things like environmental impacts, the different stakeholder interests that exist, and the potential impact of such activities, fisheries, which is in particular the primary economic driver of the Pacific region. Okay, the Western and Central Pacific Ocean, I think, is the planet's largest and most prosperous tuna fishery, and so any other activity that comes and has an environmental impact must be taken into account in terms of its potential impact on that industry as well.
Yes, indeed. I remember I think it's important to highlight that these frameworks, especially the one related to mineral exploration and exploitation, the first one, we were not really clear about the timeline. It was actually 1 year after the seabed advisory opinion of UNCLOS, the first and only advisory opinion of the dispute chamber. both Robert and I have been working actually on this 2012 framework, and it was so innovative and so exciting to be able to translate, the main principles of international law, but also the vision of precaution into a regional framework, and basically give teeth, to not only obligation but also general principles of international law, and I think what has been achieved has been not only innovative because it was really it was, I will say, a world premiere in terms of regional development to be dedicated to this topic, but also what was interesting, it was not only one framework but a package of framework.
Yes.
Maybe you can explain what has been done since 2012 and the different steps and how they complement each other.
For sure. As you mentioned, Virginie, the first framework was really the regulatory framework for deep sea minerals exploration and exploitation in 2012. Understandably, because that was the heart of the subject matter that the region was looking at the time. What do we do with exploration and exploitation of deep sea minerals, and how do we appropriately govern it? From there, and it's interesting, the timelines, because we move through from that first UNCLOS opinion on seabed mining. From 2012 to 2015, we're building up to COP21 in Paris. So there's a huge amount of new levels of awareness around things like climate vulnerability, the nexus between the climate and the ocean and biodiversity. And so in that context, the Pacific then started working on a regional environmental management framework for deep sea minerals exploration and exploitation, taking into account the environmental aspects of it, the need for decisions around both exploration and exploitation to be informed by science, so that then helps to ensure decisions that are based on best environmental management practices that are informed also by society, civil society, traditional knowledge, the wants and the needs of the peoples of the Pacific Islands that are looking at it in their relationship with the environment. And so that framework was really a guide to assist and inform the environmental components of seabed mining related decision making in the Pacific. Following that, there was also a framework on the financial aspects.
Very important as well.
How to manage revenue and wealth that is associated with exploration permits and potentially the benefits of exploitation. Is there benefit sharing? What are recommendations on public financial management and fiscal policy? How to develop a sovereign wealth fund that might be funded, for example, by the benefits of seabed mining, so that you create a fund for future generations, for example, that can become a sustainable financing mechanism.
Yeah, it's what I was about to highlight. I think it was really innovative and reflective, of the culture of the region to actually think at that time to also include the benefits for future generations and not just, the plain main short-term financial aspects. So these frameworks are so innovative, and as you mentioned, they've been influenced by many different types of issues that have actually gained importance throughout the years 2010, I will say, from 10 to 20. And interestingly also, and it's something that I'm quite fascinated about, also because usually the civil societies, as I mentioned, always talk about activities in the area and they don't really look at activities within national jurisdiction. But the two inform each other, because if you look at the timeline of the seabed advisory opinion, the seabed advisory opinion in 2011 was for activities beyond national jurisdiction, but it had a very immense impact on the regulation of activity within national jurisdiction, because the same principles actually apply. A bit different because, of course, coastal states have the right to adopt their own environmental policies. So So that's why, as you mentioned, that an environmental framework has been adopted. But the two are always linked together, and it's something really interesting. And with all of these different frameworks that have been adopted, do you think Pacific Island states are now fully or mostly or better equipped with the legislation and policies to deal with seabed activities, but also seabed management, globally speaking?
Look, I'd like to think so. I think the Pacific is perhaps one of the regions in the world, or one of the developing regions in the world, a set of tools that have been specifically developed for it and by it to deal with these issues. So they certainly have the tools at their disposal to do so. Sometimes there are, at domestic level, delays in legislative drafting and things getting adopted, and different forms of debate that take place. But there are a number of Pacific Island countries that have adopted national level legislation, policies, guidelines that have been, I think, inspired by these regional frameworks, and that allow them today to have a far more robust system in place to manage any requests that would come in for exploration or exploitation of the seabed within national jurisdiction. One of the things that I would say is, and perhaps it will emerge again, but was this idea of a regional treaty on deep sea mining that would come in after these frameworks and create a legally binding instrument that all Pacific Islands would subscribe to, and that would then provide this supranational level of international legislation that then would allow for a far more direct and directive flow down effect at national level in terms of implementation. And that was developed again over a number of years, with the idea of the Pacific having an UNCLOS compatible binding international agreement to regulate cooperation between the parties around deep sea mining activities in the region. And I think it's fascinating again that the Pacific said to itself, we don't only need things at national level that are legally binding. We need to go beyond these regional frameworks and look at something that is an internationally binding instrument for our region, so that once again we can protect and preserve it within the paradigm that we set for ourselves, and we can explore and potentially exploit it within the paradigm that we set for ourselves, trying to reconcile, again, the competing interests sometimes between protection and preservation of natural resources and the right to develop and to exploit those resources in a certain way. And unfortunately, whilst that agreement was drafted and there were a number of discussions and negotiating sessions, it didn't get adopted. But the foundation that provided, I think, again, has nourished the ongoing debate on environmental management and deep sea mining that is still going ahead today. And I think, again, has really contributed to quite a high level of awareness and literacy around this in Pacific Island governments and Pacific Island technicians, many of whom were some of the primary contributors to its drafting and development. So, again, it's a great regional effort.
Indeed, and again, extremely innovative. And do you think this agreement is actually buried, or does it will actually maybe, because sometimes we see in the region it takes so much time and effort to adopt this type of regional agreements, kind of a timeline in terms of the development of activities, or do you think it was just a way to actually strengthen, on very tangible rules that actually don't necessarily need to be adopted formally, but have been kind of, infusing a bit everywhere in the region?
Look, at a personal level, I would have loved to see the agreement be adopted, because it would have provided clarity and certainty in the Pacific, and again, with the Pacific known as vulnerable, but also as a generator of solutions that can be taken and adapted and looked at by other parts of the world to see whether or not they can also be useful in helping to address some of the similar challenges that can be faced elsewhere. I do think that the how shall I put this? The growing divergence of some interest between Pacific Island countries, from those who would call for a moratorium to others who are more willing to look at exploration and exploitation, was a potential driver behind the decision to suspend any further negotiations on that. And that's a sovereign choice by each country. But again, this goes to show how politically sensitive the discussion around deep sea mining is, internationally, but in particular in the Pacific region, with some countries that have very strong views about wanting to move ahead and pursue mining activities, countries calling very strongly for a moratorium. And the country where I live right now, New Caledonia, that I think adopted a 50-year moratorium a year or so ago. So all of this means that there are diverging views, but the region is capable of coming together and talking about those views and stating them in a calm and collected way to try and move forward on them. There was a high level, what we call a talanoa in the region, a high level meeting for discussion between leaders of the region in 2025 on deep sea mining, to take stock of national positions, to see where there were potential areas for cooperation, collaboration, and how we move things forward. And so I think whilst there isn't a shared regional position on saying 100% for a moratorium or 100% for let's go ahead and explore and potentially exploit the deep sea minerals in the Pacific, there is certainly still a very strong vein of international cooperation and discussion that takes place on this particular issue. So it's not a dead letter and it's not a taboo subject. And I think that bodes well for the future, because it allows us to continue to imagine ways in which we can cooperate and take things forward and try to reconcile these diverging interests.
Of course. It's interesting because you mentioned the diverging interest. It was where I actually wanted to go as well. But since, to place that into the context, since we're mainly focusing the discussion on within national jurisdiction, and as you mentioned at the beginning of the discussion, there's a lot of overlapping EEZ with pockets of high seas. It means that potentially if one state wants to conduct exploitation, you have, of course, higher risk of pollution, actually transboundary pollution, than in other parts of the world. And for example, in the Clarion-Clipperton zone in the area, because it's in the middle of the ocean in the high seas. So anyway, it means that the foundations of cooperation that you have in the Pacific will be essential to actually find solutions in face of the divergent interest actually of states. I'm wondering with the BBNJ agreement, because we're celebrating the entry into force this month. So a lot of Pacific countries have actually signed the BBNJ agreement. Just a few at the moment have ratified, but it takes always ages to ratify, so I'm not really worried. A provision actually agreement that is very specific to the Pacific Island context, which deals with pockets of high sea surrounded by EEZs, and requiring actually strengthened cooperation to actually manage potential environmental risk of activities conducted in these high seas pockets. How do you see actually the cooperation of Pacific states in view of the entry into force of the BBNJ agreement and potentially deep sea mining? There's many other activities. There's issues with illegal fisheries, of course. We're not going to talk about it today. But I think it's quite interesting to understand, depending on, where the activities are taking place, the specific risk and governance tools that exist and that will be required in the Pacific to actually deal with these activities.
Also, there are aspects of what's been highlighted in both the ICJ advisory opinion on climate change and on the UNCLOS advisory opinion on climate change and ocean change that are really relevant, because both of those advisory opinions took into account not the primary instruments that we were talking about. So, the UNFCCC and associated agreements with the ICJ and UNCLOS for the International Tribunal on Law of the Sea, but other international environmental agreements that are relevant to the management of whether it's the global climate system or the ocean and its resources. And in the Pacific, there are a number of multilateral environmental agreements at regional level that already provide a framework for international cooperation on issues like transboundary pollution, on issues around dangerous activities and waste. And so what I believe may happen, including for these pockets of high seas, is that the existing mechanisms at regional level will simply strengthen the international obligations that there are to manage those pockets appropriately, to take into account the potential environmental impacts, to ensure that they're appropriately anticipated and managed. There are safeguards in place that any decisions that are made are fully informed by the best available state of science, etc., because the region, if you like, isn't, how shall I put this? There's not a blank page when it comes to the requirements of regional cooperation that the seascape and environmental consequences of management, of exploration, of what I would like to think is that when it comes to those particular pockets, there may well be potential for states to hold one another accountable for avoiding transboundary pollution. And there may also be significant potential for looking at developing high seas marine protected areas on the basis of the BBNJ, but driven by some of these principles that the Pacific has internalized for so many years to ensure that those pockets are managed in a way that is as similar or as compatible as possible to what the countries have agreed to do in terms of how they manage their areas under national jurisdiction. And so, again, it could be that the Pacific is a world leader in tackling some of those challenges of the high seas pockets surrounded by areas under national jurisdiction.
Indeed, and I think it was actually the goal of my question to highlight the fact that I think the implementation of the BBNJ agreements will be very specific to the Pacific due to all the, what I call the millefeuille, like the French pastry, the millefeuille effect of all the different frameworks that exist regionally and internationally. And there's been already a lot of solutions and mechanisms that have been put in place. So it's going to be very interesting to see the implementation trends actually in the future. Maybe
Absolutely.
my last question is related this time to activities beyond national jurisdiction. As we have discussed a bit, the first UNCLOS seabed advisory opinion was actually triggered by legal concern regarding Nauru and activities beyond national jurisdiction. And to date, if I remember correctly, we have 4 Pacific states sponsoring activities in the area. Do you think states in the Pacific are more interested to conduct activities, for example, in the Clarion-Clipperton zone rather than in Oceania, or do you think it's both? I'd like to understand actually the dynamics. Is it better far away, or is it? I'm curious.
Look, I think it really does depend on the country. The Cook Islands, for example, has very clearly signaled its interest in both, and notably within areas under its national jurisdiction, in the framework of Marae Moana, its overarching ocean management plan, and whilst, for example, Nauru, the focus has primarily been on the Clarion-Clipperton zone and not within its national jurisdiction. So there are, again, differing approaches depending on the country, differing approaches depending also on the concentration of deep sea minerals that may or may not be found within the EEZs or on the seabed under the EEZ of a particular country, and the depth, the technical capability that there may be to actually go ahead and exploit those compared to something that they might have as a concession in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. So I don't think there's a single black or white response to that. What is certain, I think, is that deep sea mineral exploitation within areas under national jurisdiction is likely to be politically more sensitive domestically.
Of course.
Exploitation outside of it is politically more sensitive internationally, with the international lobbies, the campaigns for moratorium, the visibility, the negative visibility that we often see going along with that. And so countries weigh up, I think, the cost and the benefit of that economically, diplomatically, and they make their call. But it is interesting to see that there are only 4 Pacific Island sponsors currently for deep sea mining in the area. Mm-hmm. There are a growing number of countries in the Pacific that have joined the calls for either a precautionary pause or a moratorium. But all of the Pacific Island countries are supporters of more science to understand the deep sea, its ecosystems, the seabed, and what it can bring. And I think that, and without wanting to sound, how shall I put this? Like I don't want to get into a politically sensitive discussion, but I think that what's incredibly important is the consensus around the need for more science to understand the deep sea and the ocean, because on that basis, we can make really, truly informed decisions about whether or not a precautionary pause should be turned into a moratorium, or whether or not there is potential for some form of exploitation or not. Right now, we don't know what we don't know, and we don't know a lot. And so I think, again, that there's a consensus around the need for quality ocean science and quality deep sea science is something that is really positive in the Pacific. And I think something that, internationally would be great to see a lot more investment in that, because of the importance of what the deep sea can bring, and greater knowledge of it will bring to us, both from a scientific perspective, but also from an informed decision-making perspective.
Yes, I do agree with you. I mean, on many different points, there's not enough investments in scientific research in the deep sea within national jurisdiction and beyond national jurisdiction. It's immensely lacking. But what you mentioned also regarding the moratorium, I think it's very important actually for the audience to understand. There's many countries who actually didn't sign the moratorium call of the area. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually for exploitation, because it's a political call. A lot of countries are actually supporting precaution, and precaution will be anyway implemented through international law and by the International Seabed Authority. So it could be the case that even if there's no adoption of a moratorium, there will be the precaution anyway that will be implemented, which could actually block certain projects and exploitation plans. And I think what is important also to understand is that as you mentioned, on the top of the diversity of position for a precautionary pause, a moratorium, beyond national jurisdiction, there's also, I think, a good number of Pacific Island states who actually adopted a moratorium within national jurisdiction with very innovative position. You can use moratorium in Asia. I don't know if there's, I think it's to be reassessed on the objectives. I'm not sure there's a specific number of years. And this moratorium, as an example, of course, they've been able to actually insert a lot of cultural management concerns. So there's a lot of different type of solutions that could be sought, locally, regionally, and internationally. And I think a lot of people are worried about, the few numbers of states that have actually signed up for the moratorium beyond national jurisdiction, without actually realizing, the great diversity of measures that state can take, even within national jurisdiction, where actually the pressure could be really high as well to develop deep sea mining activities. and where I would say the damages are potentially higher as well because it's closer to the shores. So it will impact also much more certain type of fisheries and, coastal activities, traditional fisheries management, and, the economy of certain states.
That's for sure. I mean, look, tourism, for example, for island nations that have a beautiful marine and island environment, tourism, again, is another major driver of economic growth. And if you have offshore undersea activities that turquoise lagoon becomes muddy water, the resort loses value, no one wants to come, people lose jobs. There are a whole lot of flow-on effects from that can come from uninformed decision making around some of these exploitations that can take place nearer to shore. And so again, this is where the principle of precaution and informed, evidence-based decision making becomes key, so that what might look like the goose that lays the golden eggs doesn't turn out actually to be something that has significant adverse impacts on other economic benefits and drivers of economic growth for a particular country, and therefore is overall a negative simply because its impacts haven't been anticipated.
Yeah, indeed. And do you think, maybe will be my final question, and it's something that you've highlighted, the importance of informed decision making, and to be able to do that, you need to have enough knowledge, baseline data. Exploration leads to exploitation, but marine scientific research. Do you see any new or stronger support for marine scientific research for seabed management, or is it still something we're all hoping for to get, bigger funds and bigger interest with the current geopolitical climate, because it's quite specific at the moment as well?
It is. When you and I were together in Nice for the UN Ocean Conference, there was a lot of discussion about marine scientific research and the need for more of it. And everybody applauded with both hands and said, absolutely, we need it. It was the same in Lisbon at the preceding UN Ocean Conference. I think there's a realization that we need more of it. The issue that I have is that there's a real difference between leaders, ministers, philanthropists, multilateral funds, world superstars saying, yes, we need more of this and we want more of this, and that actually translating into more money funding the marine scientific research that is required for us to have globally the global depth of knowledge that we need to make truly informed decisions around some of these areas. And I know that it takes time, but I do think that there needs to be more. Now, obviously, this is competing at the same time with the need for increased funding for climate adaptation and for mitigation, for fighting biodiversity loss, for ecosystem restoration, for a myriad of other development challenges in the natural world, without even talking about things like human health and humanitarian crises and other things. And so, you have to be a little bit pragmatic about it. But to be honest, I think that generally speaking, we have probably promised, or we have been promised more than has been delivered on the marine scientific research front, not because the scientists aren't capable of doing it, but simply because the funding hasn't flown to them so that they can actually carry out that work at the scale that's required, given the challenge that we're faced with.
Yeah, well, it's the feedback that actually I have, from also the scientific world, with a lot of wonderful ideas and identification of really interesting topics with a very important shortage of funding, which
Absolutely.
is extremely frustrating, because it means for seabed management, I will not say within national jurisdiction, but maybe more beyond national jurisdiction, that we actually only rely on one certain type of data coming from those conducting exploration, and with no other type of data to confront with. So I think in terms of diversity of knowledge, it's always good in the scientific world to have like different points of view and analysis. So these data are really, really important to actually be accessible.
Exactly. And it'll help drive even greater ocean literacy as well. The more data on the deep sea we have from sources where one can confront different opinions and different ways of looking at things, the more literate both the global scientific community and the global ocean and environmental community, and therefore the global political community that draws on those to make political decisions and policy concepts will be. And so, you know, I can only hope that that will come in the years ahead, and that, you know, we'll have really quality driven by high quality levels of ocean literacy around the deep sea, but some approach the water to the inshore areas, to the coastal zones. So we take this whole ecosystem approach to the relationship that we have between humankind and nature, to manage it appropriately and sustainably.
Indeed, and also for the seabed, I mean, it's something we'll not have time to talk about, but the you know, the importance of not only the cultural aspect of seabed management that we've seen actually in the Gemini's hydro. If we talk about, you know, commercial activities, also genetic resources, how do you arbitrate concerns and interest between mineral activities and genetic resources that could actually be placed exactly in the same area of the seabeds? You would need to have actually more data to be able to make the choice what is the most interesting, convenient, culturally acceptable, socially acceptable activity. Is it genetic resources or minerals? I think it's a call that hasn't had to be done yet, but I'm expecting it to be actually in the years to come, because there's a lot of you know, economic activities that could be flowing from genetic resources, patents, very promising, you know, drugs, medicines, very important also for the society. So yeah, a lot of things to look forward to, actually.
There certainly are. You know, there certainly are. And, you know, added into that is the question around ocean rights as well. What impact will things like the ocean rights movement have on issues like deep sea mineral exploration and exploitation? And you know, certain regions again are leading the way in how they, and certain cultures are leading the way in how they think about that. So it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see how this evolves over the coming years, and how we perhaps can reconcile again many of these interests that might seem divergent or competing, but that might at some level have some form of common denominator to help move the debate forward.
Yes, I think the main challenge is really to move forward from, you know, compartmentalized way of looking at things, you know, and move to a holistic one. And as you mentioned, actually, even in international law, to be able to not only look at the, you know, the single lens of one framework, but to move into the millefeuille analysis, the synergies between all of them, and consistency. I think it's one of the main things we look forward to: consistency in international law and policy approaches, actually. Well, Cameron, it's been a real pleasure discussing with you. I think we could keep on discussing for hours, but unfortunately will be too long. Thank you very much for sharing with us your knowledge and your amazing experience of the Pacific region. And I look forward to seeing you in person very soon.
Thank you, Virginie. Thanks very much for the invitation. I look forward to catching up with you in person very soon also.
Okay. Have a nice week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.